Good evening. Tonight we begin with something that bubbles and hisses in darkened lounges, something that wrapped itself in the silk of tradition while delivering a chemical hook as old as colonialism itself. The hookah, water pipe, shisha, nargile, whatever name you give it, the story is the same. A device born in royal courts, refined by craftsmen, blessed by poets, and eventually turned into a vector for addiction dressed in the costume of culture. Forget the sweet apple-scented smoke and the Instagram-ready setups. Its true history winds through Mughal palaces, Persian coffee houses, Ottoman harems, Victorian curiosity cabinets, and finally into the strip malls of suburban America, where teenagers gathered around glass and chrome thinking themselves safer than their cigarette-smoking peers. Sometimes ceremony, sometimes commerce, always chemistry. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a day navigating its contradictions, drop you into a 16th century Persian salon or a 21st century enforcement hearing, and what seemed harmless could just as easily condemn. Take a second to like and subscribe if this is the kind of content you enjoy. And in the comments, share your location and the time where you are. I love seeing how far and wide our community reaches. Silence your notifications. Take a deeper breath, not from a hose. The hookah did not emerge fully formed from some ancient mist. It was engineered, deliberately, in response to a specific problem posed by a specific historical moment. The year is somewhere in the late 15th or early 16th century. The place, the courts of Safavid Persia, or perhaps the Mughal territories of the Indian subcontinent. The records are contested, as records from that era often are, smudged by time and by the tendency of empires to claim innovations as their own. What we know with reasonable certainty is this: tobacco, that American plant which Columbus and his successors brought back across the Atlantic, arrived in the Old World sometime in the early 1500s. By the late 16th century, it had spread with remarkable speed through trade routes, carried by Portuguese merchants, Ottoman traders, and Safavid courtiers. The leaf was smoked in pipes, chewed, ground into snuff. Its effect stimulating, calming, addictive, made it both fashionable and controversial. Enter the hookah, a technological response to a pharmacological problem. The story, preserved in fragments of court chronicles and later travel narratives, suggests that a physician in the Mughal court, some accounts name Hakim Abul Fath Gilani, physician to Emperor Akbar, designed the apparatus to purify tobacco smoke by passing it through water. The logic was humoral medicine's logic. Water would cool the smoke, filter its noxious elements, render it less harmful to the delicate constitutions of nobles and scholars. The device itself was elegant in its simplicity. A base, often made of glass, metal, or ceramic, filled with water, a vertical stem rising from the water chamber. At the top, a bowl to hold burning tobacco or other smokable material, and from the side, a flexible hose through which the smoker would draw. The physics were straightforward. Heat from charcoal placed atop the tobacco would vaporize the compounds in the leaf. The smoker's inhalation created negative pressure, drawing smoke down through the stem, bubbling it through the water, and up through the hose to the mouth. The materials told stories of wealth and craft. Early hookahs in Mughal India were objects of incredible artistry. Bases carved from coconut shells inlaid with silver, glass vessels blown by Persian craftsmen who had perfected their art over centuries, brass and copper fittings hammered and chased with floral patterns, hoses made from leather or woven silk, sometimes scented with rosewater or musk. These were not mere smoking devices. They were status symbols, conversation pieces, markers of refinement, The practice spread through the courtly networks of South Asia and Persia. In the Mughal palaces of Agra, Delhi, and Lahore, hookahs became fixtures of aristocratic life. Miniature paintings from the period show emperors reclining on cushions, hookah hoses in hand, surrounded by courtiers and musicians. The smoke rising in delicate plumes against backgrounds of architectural grandeur. The water bubbling softly, a kind of liquid punctuation to conversation. Persian Safavid courts adopted and adapted the practice. In Isfahan, that jewel of Persian architecture under Shah Abbas I, the hookah became integrated into the rituals of the coffee house and the salon. Poets gathered to recite verses while passing the hose. Philosophers debated while the charcoal glowed. The water pipe became associated with intellectual and aesthetic refinement, a tool for contemplation as much as intoxication. The chemistry, of course, was more complicated than the court physicians imagined. Water does cool smoke. It does trap some particulates, but nicotine, that alkaloid which gives tobacco its grip, is water-soluble only to a degree, and most of it passes through into the smoker's lungs along with carbon monoxide, tar, and a constellation of other compounds. The purification was partial at best, illusory at worst. But belief is a powerful thing. If a Mughal noble believed the water filtered harm, the ritual itself became therapeutic, regardless of chemical reality. The hookah's journey westward into Ottoman lands transformed it from courtly accessory to urban institution. By the early 17th century, the water pipe had crossed the border from Safavid Persia into Ottoman territories, carried by merchants, diplomats, and the perpetual flow of goods and ideas along the Silk Road's tributaries. Istanbul, that city of domes and minarets straddling two continents, became the hookah's second home. The coffee house, already established as a social institution in Ottoman cities, provided the perfect setting. These were not the quiet cafes of later European imagination. Ottoman coffee houses were loud, crowded, democratic spaces where men from different classes gathered to drink coffee, play backgammon, listen to storytellers, and, increasingly, smoke tobacco through water pipes. The Ottoman authorities viewed this development with suspicion. Sultan Murad IV, who ruled from 1623 to 1640, was particularly severe. He banned tobacco and coffee, viewing them as corrupting influences that encouraged idleness and sedition. The punishments were brutal. There are accounts, possibly exaggerated but revealing in their circulation, of smokers being caught in coffee houses and executed on the spot. Murad himself was said to wander the streets in disguise, looking for violators. The bans failed. They always do when the thing banned is both pleasurable and socially embedded. After Murad's death, the prohibitions softened and eventually disappeared. Coffee houses reopened. Hookahs returned. By the late 17th century, smoking tobacco through a water pipe was so common in Ottoman cities that European travelers remarked on it with a mixture of fascination and moral disapproval. The hookah in Ottoman society developed its own etiquette and mythology. There were rules about who could refuse the pipe, how to pass it, when to speak, and when to remain silent. The quality of tobacco mattered. Persian tobacco, particularly from the Shiraz region, was prized for its smoothness and flavor. The preparation of the tobacco became a minor art form. It was washed, sometimes fermented, mixed with molasses or honey to add sweetness, flavored with fruits or flowers. Women, too, partook, though in different spaces. In harems and private quarters, aristocratic Ottoman women smoked elaborate hookahs as they conversed, listened to music, or simply passed the afternoon hours. European visitors to these spaces, rare as such visits were, often wrote about the opulence of the settings and the grace with which women handled the pipes. The economics of the hookah trade created new industries. Craftsmen specialized in particular components. Glass blowers in Hebron and Damascus produced bases. Metal workers in Istanbul and Aleppo fashioned stems and bowls. Leather workers and weavers made hoses. A single high-quality hookah might incorporate materials and labor from across the empire, a supply chain held together by merchants who understood both craft and commerce. The Ottoman hookah also became an instrument of diplomacy. When European ambassadors visited the Sublime Porte, they were often offered the water pipe as a gesture of hospitality. Some accepted, others declined. Those who smoked often wrote about the experience in their dispatches home, describing the strange sensation of cool smoke, the sweetness of the tobacco, the leisurely pace of Ottoman social life that seemed so foreign to European sensibilities, shaped by different rhythms of commerce and faith. To understand the hookah's endurance, one must understand its design not merely as functional apparatus, but as a carefully engineered system that transforms a harsh experience into something almost gentle that disguises chemistry with ceremony. The base, typically called the vase or jar, holds water to a depth of an inch or two. In traditional designs, this might be glass, allowing smokers to watch the bubbles rise, or ceramic, decorated with glazes and patterns that speak to regional aesthetics. Persian bases often featured intricate floral motifs. Turkish ones might display geometric patterns or calligraphy. Indian bases sometimes incorporated metalwork, brass or copper fittings that caught lamplight. The body tube, vertical and hollow, plunges into the water at the bottom and rises to connect with the bowl plate at the top. This is the highway for smoke, the channel through which heated vapor makes its journey from combustion to consumption. In well-made hookahs, this tube is precisely engineered too narrow, and the draw becomes difficult, too wide, and the smoke loses concentration. The bowl, where tobacco meets fire, is perhaps the most variable component. Traditional bowls were simple clay affairs, porous and replaceable. Modern designs introduced glazed, ceramic, metal bowls with heat management features, silicone bowls that promise durability. The size matters. A larger bowl means longer sessions, more smoke, more nicotine delivery. The hose, flexible and personal, is where mouth meets apparatus. Early hoses were leather, sometimes lined with metal wire to prevent collapse, scented to add to the experience. Later materials included plastic, silicone, and washable compounds. The mouthpiece, typically wood, metal, or plastic, is the final interface. In social settings, disposable mouthpiece tips emerged as a hygiene measure, though they also served as tacit acknowledgement that sharing a hookah meant sharing saliva, breath, and whatever pathogens rode along. The charcoal sits atop the bowl, not touching the tobacco directly in well-managed setups, but close enough to heat it to the point of vaporization. Early charcoals were wood-based. Later ones used coconut shells or compressed materials that burned longer and more evenly. The choice of charcoal affects everything. Too hot, and the tobacco burns, producing harsh smoke and destroying flavor. Too cool and the session dies, requiring constant relighting. What makes this design insidious from a public health perspective is precisely what makes it appealing from a user's perspective. The water cooling and the indirect heating combine to create smoke that feels smoother, cooler, less irritating to the throat and lungs than cigarette smoke. This smoothness is deceptive. It encourages deeper inhalations, longer sessions. Where a cigarette might be smoked in 5 minutes, a hookah session often extends to an hour or more. The volume of smoke inhaled in a single session can exceed the smoke from dozens of cigarettes. The water filtration, that seemingly benign feature, captures some particulates and water-soluble compounds. Studies using spectroscopy and chemical analysis show that water does trap some harmful substances, but nicotine, carbon monoxide, heavy metals from the tobacco leaf, and many carcinogenic compounds pass through largely unfiltered. The water provides an illusion of safety while delivering a payload that is, by some measures, more concentrated than conventional cigarette smoke. The hookah's spread followed the patterns of commerce and empire, adapting to each new region's materials, tastes, and social structures. The device that began in Persian courts and Mughal palaces found new forms in Southeast Asia, North Africa, and eventually in European curiosity cabinets and smoking rooms. In Egypt, the hookah took on the name shisha and became deeply woven into cafe culture. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Cairo's coffee houses were thick with the sound of bubbling water and the scent of molasses-soaked tobacco. Egyptian craftsmen developed their own aesthetic, ornate brass work, bulbous glass bases, and a preference for lighter, sweeter tobacco preparations. The shisha became a fixture of social life across class lines. Working men smoked in simple cafes. Merchants and officials smoked in more refined establishments. The device became so identified with Egyptian urban life that European travelers' accounts of Cairo inevitably included descriptions of men sitting in groups, passing the hose, sipping coffee or tea. In North Africa, particularly Morocco and Algeria, the hookah appeared but never achieved the same dominance as in Egypt or the Levant. Instead, the sebsi, a long-stemmed pipe, and later the cigarette, became the preferred tobacco delivery methods. Still, in certain regions and among certain groups, water pipes were smoked, often in settings associated with leisure and festival. Southeast Asia received the hookah through multiple vectors, Muslim traders bringing it from the Middle East and India, and later colonial administrators and merchants who found the practice exotic and adopted it as a marker of cosmopolitan experience. In Malaysia and Indonesia, the hookah appeared in royal courts and among merchant classes, though it competed with local smoking traditions and eventually with mass-produced cigarettes. China's encounter with the hookah is murkier and less well documented. Water pipes existed in China. Evidence suggests certain forms of water-cooled tobacco smoking in the Qing dynasty. But whether these derived from the Persian Mughal tradition or developed independently is a matter of scholarly debate. What is clear is that by the 19th century, Chinese opium smokers sometimes used water pipes, though the classic opium pipe had a different design and purpose. Europe's relationship with the hookah was always one of curiosity tinged with moral superiority. Beginning in the 17th century, European travelers returned from the Ottoman Empire and Persia with tales of strange customs. Some brought hookahs back as curiosities. By the 19th century, during the height of Orientalist fascination, European elites sometimes set up Turkish corners in their homes, complete with divans, carpets, and hookahs, spaces where they could play-act Eastern decadence. Victorian England saw a small vogue for the hookah among certain artistic and literary circles. The apparatus appeared in photographs and paintings of bohemian gatherings, but it never penetrated mainstream British smoking culture the way cigars and pipes did. The hookah remained exotic, a prop in the theatre of empire, something to be observed and occasionally sampled, but not integrated into daily life. The United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries had almost no hookah culture. Tobacco was smoked in cigars, pipes, and increasingly cigarettes. The water pipe was relegated to ethnographic museums or the private collections of Orientalist scholars. This absence is important because it meant that when the hookah did arrive in America, in the late 20th century, it arrived as something almost entirely unfamiliar, unencumbered by local tradition, ready to be reinvented. To speak of the hookah without speaking of what is smoked within it is to miss half the story. The tobacco prepared for water pipes, particularly the modern sweetened variety known variously as shisha tobacco, muassel, or tumbak, has its own distinct history and chemistry. Traditional hookah tobacco in Persia and India was often unflavored, or lightly treated with rose water or other aromatics. The tobacco itself came from varieties cultivated specifically for water pipe use, dark, potent leaves that could withstand the indirect heating without burning too quickly. Preparation involved washing and sometimes fermenting the leaves, then cutting them into a consistency that would pack into the bowl and heat evenly. The transformation came with the introduction of molasses and glycerin-based preparations, likely in the 19th century, though the exact timeline is hazy. Egyptian and Lebanese tobacco preparers began mixing tobacco with molasses, honey, and fruit pulp. This served several purposes. It added sweetness that masked tobacco's natural bitterness. It created moisture that prevented the tobacco from burning too hot, and it produced thick, visible smoke that made the experience more satisfying and social. The chemistry of muassel is worth examining. The typical modern hookah tobacco contains tobacco leaf, often about 30% by weight, molasses or honey 40–50%, glycerin 10–20%, and flavorings 1–5%. The remaining percentage is water. The tobacco provides nicotine, the addictive alkaloid. The molasses and glycerin serve as humectants, keeping the mixture moist, and as agents that vaporize to create the thick clouds of smoke that are the hookah's visual signature. Flavoring became an arms race of innovation. Early flavors were simple: apple, mint, grape. By the late 20th century, manufacturers offered dozens, then hundreds of varieties. Double apple, a mixture of sweet and dry apple flavors, became iconic in the Middle East. Mint remained perennially popular, but then came mango, watermelon, cappuccino, bubblegum, piña colada, and countless others. The flavorings are often synthetic, chemical compounds designed to mimic fruit or dessert flavors, though some premium brands use natural extracts. This sweetening and flavoring had consequences. It made hookah smoking more appealing, particularly to younger users and those who might find the harshness of cigarettes off-putting. Public health researchers would later identify this as a critical factor in hookah's resurgence. The perception that fruit-flavored smoke was somehow less harmful, more natural, safer than tobacco cigarettes. The nicotine delivery in hookah smoking is complex and dose-dependent. A typical cigarette delivers about 1 to 2 milligrams of nicotine to the bloodstream. A hookah session, which might last an hour and involve hundreds of puffs, can deliver comparable or higher amounts of nicotine, though the absorption curve is different: slower onset, longer duration. Studies measuring nicotine levels in hookah smokers' blood have found significant spikes, enough to create and sustain addiction. Carbon monoxide is another danger rarely discussed in hookah circles. The charcoal used to heat the tobacco produces carbon monoxide continuously. In poorly ventilated spaces, levels can rise to dangerous concentrations. Hookah smokers have been hospitalized for carbon monoxide poisoning after extended sessions in enclosed rooms. The symptoms, headache, dizziness, nausea, are often mistaken for other causes. The 19th century brought massive disruptions to the regions where hookah smoking was traditional. European colonial expansion, industrialization, and the aggressive marketing of manufactured cigarettes combined to reshape tobacco consumption globally. In India, British colonial rule brought new economic structures and new products. The British American Tobacco Company and other cigarette manufacturers established factories and distribution networks. Cigarettes, mass-produced and heavily advertised, began to displace traditional forms of tobacco consumption. The hookah did not disappear. It remained common in rural areas and among older generations, but it lost cultural ground, particularly among the urban middle classes who saw cigarettes as modern and cosmopolitan. In the Ottoman Empire and its successor states, a similar pattern emerged. The empire's dissolution after World War I, the rise of new nation-states, and the rush to modernize all contributed to changing smoking habits. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's Turkey deliberately promoted Western habits as part of a broader project of secularization and modernization. Cigarettes fit that narrative better than the hookah, which was increasingly associated with a backward-looking past. Egypt presented a more complex picture. While cigarette consumption increased dramatically, the shisha retained its place in cafe culture. This was partly because cafe life itself remained vibrant and central to urban social structures in ways that had declined in Turkey. Egyptian cigarette manufacturers even got into the shisha tobacco business, recognizing that the two markets could coexist. European powers also brought public health concerns that framed tobacco, and by extension, hookah smoking as a medical and moral problem. Colonial health officials, armed with early epidemiological studies linking tobacco to disease, sometimes attempted to discourage or regulate hookah use. These efforts were rarely successful and often half-hearted, given that European powers were themselves profiting from tobacco cultivation and sales in their colonies. The interwar period saw the hookah retreat further into private and traditional spaces. In the grand cafes of Cairo and Damascus, it remained visible, but in many other contexts, it became something practiced at home, in family gatherings, in rural areas resistant to the march of modernity. The hookah was no longer fashionable, it was nostalgic, a link to a past that seemed increasingly distant. Ironically, this decline created the conditions for the hookah's later revival. Because it was not commercialized and industrialized in the way cigarettes were, because it remained tied to artisanal production and local customs, it retained a kind of authenticity that cigarettes, with their mass-market sameness, lacked. When cultural and commercial forces later sought to revive hookah smoking, they could draw on this reservoir of tradition. The hookah's return from the margins began quietly in the 1960s and 1970s, driven by Middle Eastern and South Asian diaspora communities settling in Western cities. In London, Paris, New York, and Los Angeles, immigrant neighborhoods saw the opening of small cafes and restaurants where hookah was offered alongside traditional foods. These establishments served primarily immigrant communities, places where Arabic or Urdu was spoken, where men gathered after work to play cards, watch soccer, and smoke. For the immigrants who frequented these spaces, the hookah was more than a nicotine delivery device. It was a connection to home, a ritual that recreated something of the atmosphere they had left behind. The sound of Arabic music, the taste of sweet mint tea, the bubbling of the water pipe, these sensory markers provided comfort and continuity in unfamiliar cities. But something else happened in the 1990s and accelerated in the early 2000s. The hookah crossed over. What had been an ethnic enclave practice began to attract young Americans and Europeans who were not of Middle Eastern or South Asian descent. The reasons for this crossover are multiple and intertwined. First, there was the appeal of exoticism. In an era when multiculturalism was becoming mainstream and ethnic foods were trendy, the hookah offered a taste of the authentic other. Going to a hookah bar felt cosmopolitan, worldly, a way to signal openness to different cultures. Second, there was the social aspect. Hookah smoking, unlike cigarette smoking, was inherently communal. Lounges set up hookahs at low tables, surrounded by cushions and couches, creating intimate seating arrangements that encouraged conversation and lingering. For college students and young adults looking for alternatives to loud bars and expensive clubs, hookah lounges offered something different, a place to talk, relax, and socialize without the pressure of alcohol. Third, there was the perception of safety. This is where public health concerns enter. Many young smokers believed, incorrectly, that hookah smoking was safer than cigarettes. The reasoning went, the smoke passes through water, which filters out harmful substances. The tobacco is flavored and natural, not full of chemicals like cigarettes. A hookah session is occasional, not the pack-a-day habit of cigarette smokers. This perception was reinforced by the way hookah lounges marketed themselves. They emphasized relaxation, tradition, and social connection. They rarely mentioned nicotine or addiction. The flavors watermelon, mint, cappuccino sounded harmless, even healthy. The apparatus itself, with its artisanal glass and brass, seemed more like a craft object than drug paraphernalia. Entrepreneurs saw opportunity. In cities across the United States and Europe, hookah lounges proliferated in the early 2000s. Some were upscale, with plush seating and elaborate decor. Others were bare-bones operations in strip malls. Many were concentrated near college campuses, targeting students looking for affordable nightlife alternatives. The business model was straightforward. Charge for hookah rentals by the hour. Sell flavored tobacco in-house. Offer drinks and snacks. Margins were decent. Startup costs were relatively low, some furniture, a collection of hookahs, bulk tobacco, and charcoal. Regulations varied wildly. Some jurisdictions treated hookah lounges like any other tobacco establishment. Others had no specific rules, allowing lounges to operate in a grey zone. Marketing often exploited cultural stereotypes. Lounges used names that evoked Arabian Nights fantasies. Decor featured Orientalist clichés, hanging lamps, ornate rugs, images of camels and palm trees. The music was often a sanitized version of Middle Eastern pop. This packaging, while commercially effective, reduced a complex cultural practice to a consumable aesthetic, stripping it of context and history. As hookah's popularity surged in the West, public health researchers began to take notice. What they found alarmed them. Early studies in the 2000s measured the volume of smoke inhaled during typical hookah sessions. The results were striking. A single hour-long session could involve inhaling the equivalent of 100 to 200 cigarettes worth of smoke volume. While volume does not directly translate to harm, the composition and concentration of toxins matter. The sheer amount was concerning. Chemical analyses of hookah smoke revealed a troubling profile. Carbon monoxide levels during sessions often exceeded safe thresholds. Nicotine delivery, while variable, was sufficient to create dependence. Carcinogens like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and heavy metals were detected. Tobacco-specific nitrosamines, known cancer agents, were present. The water filtration, rather than being the protective mechanism users believed it to be, was shown to remove only a small fraction of toxins. Studies using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry demonstrated that most harmful compounds passed through the water largely unchanged. The cooling effect of the water allowed smokers to inhale more deeply and more frequently, potentially increasing exposure. Public health organizations began issuing warnings. The World Health Organization released advisories noting that hookah smoking was not a safe alternative to cigarettes. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States published fact sheets outlining risks: addiction, respiratory diseases, cardiovascular effects, and potential cancer risk. Epidemiological research, though still limited compared to the vast literature on cigarettes, began to accumulate. Studies in Middle Eastern countries where hookah use was more widespread and long-standing found associations between hookah smoking and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, reduced lung function, and increased risk of certain cancers. Cardiovascular studies suggested links to heart disease and impaired vascular function. There was also the question of infectious disease transmission. Sharing a hookah hose, despite the use of disposable tips, raised concerns about tuberculosis, hepatitis, and other pathogens that could be transmitted through saliva. Outbreaks of infectious diseases traced to hookah lounges were reported, though rarely. Youth use became a particular focus. Surveys in the United States found that hookah smoking among high school and college students had increased significantly. Data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey showed that by the mid-2010s, hookah was the second most common form of tobacco use among young people, after cigarettes and later e-cigarettes. The flavoring was identified as a key factor in youth appeal. Just as flavored cigarettes had been restricted in many jurisdictions, public health advocates called for similar restrictions on flavored hookah tobacco. The argument was straightforward. Fruit and candy flavors attract young people who might otherwise avoid tobacco. Regulatory responses varied by country and region. Some European countries incorporated hookah lounges into existing tobacco control frameworks, requiring warning labels, restricting advertising, and prohibiting smoking in certain public places. Others did little, treating hookah as a niche practice not worth the regulatory effort. In the United States, the regulatory patchwork reflected federalism's complexities. The Food and Drug Administration gained authority over tobacco products in 2009, but hookah tobacco fell into a grey area. Many lounges argued that their products were exempt or that existing rules did not clearly apply. Litigation and regulatory clarifications dragged on for years. Some cities and states took matters into their own hands. New York City, for example, cracked down on hookah lounges that violated clean indoor air laws. California debated flavor bans that would include hookah, tobacco. College campuses, responding to student health concerns, sometimes banned hookah from dormitories and campus facilities. The industry pushed back. Trade associations argued that hookah was a traditional cultural practice being unfairly targeted. They pointed out that adult users should have the right to make informed choices. They disputed some of the more alarming public health claims, arguing that the research was preliminary or that it did not account for patterns of use that differed from heavy cigarette smoking. The hookah, like all consumer products in the 21st century, did not stand still. Entrepreneurs and manufacturers innovated, introducing new technologies and products that claimed to address health concerns while preserving the social experience. Heat management devices, HMDs, emerged in the early 2010s. These are metal contraptions placed on top of the hookah bowl to regulate the distribution of heat from the charcoal. The claimed benefits: more even heating, longer sessions, less risk of burning the tobacco, and reduced carbon monoxide exposure because the charcoal sits further from the tobacco. Whether these devices meaningfully reduce harm is debatable, but they became popular among hookah enthusiasts. Electronic hookahs, or e-hookahs, appeared, devices that use battery-powered heating elements to vaporize flavored liquids, similar to e-cigarettes but designed to mimic the hookah experience. These products often contain nicotine but no tobacco. Manufacturers marketed them as cleaner and safer. Regulators struggled to classify them. Were they tobacco products, electronic nicotine delivery systems, or something else? Herbal or tobacco-free hookah products also proliferated. These mixtures replaced tobacco leaf with tea leaves, sugarcane, or other plant materials, soaked in molasses and flavorings. The pitch was simple. All the flavor and social experience of hookah without the nicotine or tobacco-specific carcinogens. Public health experts noted, however, that burning organic material still produces carbon monoxide and other harmful combustion byproducts. The aesthetics of hookah also evolved. Traditional brass and glass gave way to modern materials. Stainless steel, aircraft-grade aluminum, silicone. Hookahs became modular, customizable, with interchangeable parts and accessories. High-end models from brands like Khalil Mamoon, Sheikah, and Starbuzz became status symbols among aficionados. Social media played a significant role in hookah's modern identity. Instagram and YouTube filled with images and videos of elaborate smoke tricks, reviews of new flavors and devices, and lifestyle content that positioned hookah smoking as glamorous and sophisticated. Influencers partnered with brands. Lounges became backdrops for photos curated to project a certain cosmopolitan vibe. The harm reduction debate in tobacco control also touched hookah. Some public health researchers argued for a continuum approach. If people are going to smoke, encouraging less harmful forms might reduce overall morbidity and mortality. By this logic, if hookah delivers nicotine in a way that is less carcinogenic than cigarettes, a claim that remains contested, it might be a lesser evil. Others vehemently disagreed. They pointed out that hookah is not harmless, that promoting it as a safer alternative could lead to dual use, people smoking both cigarettes and hookah, or could attract never smokers into nicotine addiction. The precautionary principle, they argued, demands discouraging all forms of tobacco use. The rise of vaping complicated the landscape further. E-cigarettes offered a nicotine delivery system that was, by many measures, less harmful than combustible tobacco. For young people seeking a social smoking experience, e-cigarettes and vape pens became competitors to hookah. Some hookah lounges adapted by offering vaping alongside traditional hookahs. Today, hookah smoking exhibits distinct patterns shaped by region, culture, economics, and regulation. In the Middle East and North Africa, hookah remains deeply embedded in social life. In countries like Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine, shisha cafes are ubiquitous. They range from humble roadside setups with a few plastic chairs to upscale lounges with elaborate decor. The clientele spans generations and classes. It is not unusual to see grandfathers smoking alongside their grandsons, or groups of women gathered around a hookah in a family home. Surveys in these regions often show hookah use prevalence rates that rival or exceed cigarette smoking, particularly among young adults. The cultural normalization means that many people do not view hookah as a significant health risk, or even as smoking in the same way cigarettes are understood. In South Asia, particularly India and Pakistan, hookah, often called hookah, retains a presence, though it has been largely displaced by cigarettes and, more recently, smokeless tobacco products. In rural areas, and among older generations, traditional hookah smoking persists. Urban revival has occurred in some cities where hookah lounges cater to young, affluent consumers. In Europe, hookah lounges cluster in immigrant neighborhoods and cosmopolitan urban centers. Cities like London, Paris, Berlin, and Amsterdam have thriving hookah scenes. Regulation varies. Some countries have strict clean air laws that restrict hookah lounges. Others are more permissive. In the United States, hookah's peak may have passed. Increasing regulation, public health campaigns, and competition from vaping have slowed the industry's growth. Many lounges have closed. Those that remain often diversify, offering food, alcohol, and entertainment beyond hookah. College towns still see significant use, but overall prevalence among young people has plateaued or declined in recent years. In East Asia, hookah has made only minor inroads. China, Japan, and South Korea have strong cigarette cultures and, increasingly, vaping cultures, but hookah has not gained widespread traction. The social contexts and preferences that made hookah popular elsewhere have not translated effectively. Sub-Saharan Africa presents a mixed picture. In North African countries, patterns resemble the broader Middle East. In other regions, traditional forms of tobacco use compete with cigarettes, and hookah remains a marginal practice, mostly found in tourist areas or among expatriate communities. At the heart of the public health concern about hookah is nicotine, that simple alkaloid that has shaped economies, triggered wars, and enslaved minds. Nicotine dependence develops through repeated exposure. Each hit of nicotine triggers the release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathways, creating a pleasurable sensation. Over time, the brain adapts, and users need nicotine not just for pleasure, but to feel normal. Withdrawal symptoms, irritability, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, drive continued use. Hookah delivers nicotine, though the pharmacokinetics differ from cigarettes. A cigarette provides a rapid spike in blood nicotine, a quick hit that satisfies craving and then dissipates. Hookah sessions deliver nicotine more gradually over a longer period. This sustained exposure can be sufficient to maintain dependence, particularly if sessions are frequent. Studies have documented that regular hookah smokers exhibit signs of nicotine addiction, failed quit attempts, continued use despite health concerns, and withdrawal symptoms when trying to stop. Some users report that they began with occasional hookah smoking and progressed to daily or near-daily use. The gateway hypothesis, the idea that hookah smoking leads to cigarette smoking or other substance use, is contentious. Some longitudinal studies have found that adolescents who smoke hookah are more likely to later smoke cigarettes. The causal mechanism is debated. Is hookah priming the brain for addiction, or are individuals who try hookah simply more likely to experiment with other substances? Opponents of the gateway theory note that correlation does not imply causation. They argue that personality traits, social environment, and peer influence are confounders that might explain the association without hookah itself being a direct cause. What is clearer is that hookah is often a social entry point into tobacco use. For young people who would not consider buying a pack of cigarettes, going to a hookah lounge with friends feels different, less serious, more of an experience than a habit. The first exposure to nicotine in this context can be the beginning of a trajectory that includes other forms of tobacco or nicotine. Public health messaging has struggled to convey the risks effectively. The complexity of hookah longer sessions but intermittent use, social setting but addictive substance, cultural tradition but modern health threat, does not fit neatly into sound bites. The message, "hookah is not safe," competes with lived experience and cultural narratives that say otherwise. The future of hookah as a commercial and cultural practice will be shaped by regulatory decisions, public health priorities, and market forces. Stricter tobacco control policies globally could significantly impact hookah. Comprehensive smoke-free laws, flavor bans, taxation, and graphic warning labels have all been proposed or implemented in various jurisdictions. Each of these measures changes the calculus for businesses and consumers. Flavor restrictions are particularly significant. If hookah tobacco is limited to unflavored or tobacco-flavored only, the appeal to young people and novice smokers diminishes. The industry has fought such restrictions, arguing that adults should have access to a variety of products and that eliminating flavors would drive consumers to illicit markets. Taxation is a double-edged tool. Higher taxes reduce consumption, particularly among price-sensitive youth, but hookah sessions are already social events with costs shared among groups, making them less responsive to price increases than individual cigarette purchases. Moreover, Small-scale hookah lounges often operate on thin margins, and tax increases could force closures. Licensing and zoning regulations can limit where hookah lounges operate. Some cities have banned new hookah establishments within certain distances of schools, restricted them to commercial districts, or required special permits that are difficult to obtain. These spatial restrictions reduce visibility and accessibility. Product regulation, if applied rigorously, could mandate disclosures of ingredients, limits on nicotine content, and standardized packaging. The FDA's regulatory framework for tobacco products in the United States includes such provisions. Though enforcement has been inconsistent, the industry, such as it is, remains fragmented. Unlike cigarettes, which are dominated by a handful of multinational corporations, hookah tobacco production is distributed across many small and medium manufacturers, particularly in the Middle East and South Asia. This fragmentation makes industry coordination and lobbying less effective, but also makes comprehensive regulation harder to enforce. Some manufacturers have moved toward harm reduction products, tobacco-free herbal mixtures, lower nicotine blends, products that claim to reduce carbon monoxide exposure. Whether these innovations genuinely reduce harm or simply allow manufacturers to navigate regulatory restrictions while maintaining markets is an open question. The COVID-19 pandemic had a notable impact on hookah lounges. Social distancing measures, restrictions on indoor gatherings, and heightened awareness of respiratory transmission closed lounges temporarily or permanently in many places. Post-pandemic recovery has been uneven. Some lounges adapted by offering outdoor seating or delivery services. Others never reopened. Looking forward, the trajectory seems likely to be one of slow decline in the West, continued prevalence in the Middle East and North Africa, and niche persistence in other markets. Hookah will not disappear. It is too culturally embedded in some regions, too profitable in certain niches, but it is unlikely to return to the growth it experienced in the early 2000s. Emerging markets in Africa and Asia could see growth if hookah is marketed as a modern social experience to burgeoning middle classes. But these regions are also targets for e-cigarette companies, and the competition for nicotine consumers will shape which products dominate. The hookah's renaissance in the early 21st century was, in many ways, a youth movement. Understanding how hookah became embedded in college and high school culture reveals much about the broader dynamics of tobacco use, peer influence, and the ways young people negotiate identity and risk. The pattern began innocuously enough in the late 1990s and early 2000s. College students, particularly in urban areas with diverse populations, began discovering hookah lounges in immigrant neighborhoods. What drew them initially was curiosity and the appeal of something different from the usual bar scene. Hookah lounges offered alcohol-free socializing, though some also served alcohol, comfortable seating, and an exotic atmosphere that felt sophisticated without being pretentious. Word spread through social networks. A student who had visited a hookah lounge would bring friends on the next visit. Those friends would tell others. Before long, hookah nights became regular features of college social calendars, particularly among certain demographic groups. Students interested in Middle Eastern or South Asian cultures, international students from countries where hookah was familiar, and progressively, a broader cross-section of the student body. The appeal to young people operated on multiple levels. There was the sensory experience, the sweet flavors, the thick smoke, the ritualistic preparation and sharing. There was the social dimension. Hookah smoking was inherently communal, encouraging conversation and creating shared experiences. There was the perceived safety. Unlike alcohol, which could lead to obviously impaired behavior and consequences, hookah seemed controlled and moderate. There was also, importantly, the identity work that hookah allowed. For children of immigrants, smoking hookah could be a way to connect with cultural heritage. For students interested in cosmopolitanism and global cultures, it signaled openness and sophistication. For those seeking alternatives to mainstream American college culture, hookah lounges provided different social spaces with different norms and aesthetics. Entrepreneurs near campuses quickly recognized the market opportunity. Strip malls within walking distance of universities saw hookah lounges open alongside pizza shops and coffee bars. The business model was straightforward: attract students with cheap entry points. Lounges often didn't charge cover, making money instead on hookah rentals and beverages, create comfortable atmospheres conducive to long stays, and rely on word-of-mouth marketing. These campus-adjacent lounges varied in quality and character. Some were professionally run with attention to decor, service, and ambience. They might feature modern furniture, sophisticated lighting, playlists of Middle Eastern pop or electronic music, and menus with dozens of flavor options. Others were bare-bones operations: folding tables, mismatched couches, poor ventilation, limited flavor selection. The social dynamics within these spaces were complex. Hookah lounges became third spaces, neither home nor classroom, where different social groups could mix. Pre-medical students studied while smoking. Engineering students debated projects over a hookah. Drama students rehearsed lines. The lounges functioned as informal campus extensions. Gender dynamics in these spaces reflected both traditional patterns and contemporary norms. In traditional Middle Eastern coffee houses, hookah smoking had been predominantly male. In American college area lounges, women participated equally. This gender mixing was itself a site of cultural negotiation, particularly for students from conservative backgrounds who might feel conflicted about participating in mixed-gender social smoking. The perception of hookah as safe or safer than cigarettes was perhaps the most consequential aspect of its appeal to youth. Surveys of college students consistently found that a majority believed hookah carried little to no health risk, or at least less risk than cigarettes. When researchers asked why, students cited the water filtration, the natural ingredients of flavored tobacco, and the infrequent pattern of use. This perception was reinforced by social comparisons. Students saw peers who smoked cigarettes facing social stigma. Smoking areas were often isolated. Smokers were sometimes viewed as addicts or as making poor health choices. Hookah smokers, by contrast, were just having fun, being social, experiencing culture. The contexts of use created different meanings. Public health researchers studying college hookah used documented patterns that were cause for concern. While many students did indeed smoke infrequently, perhaps once or twice a month, a substantial minority developed more regular habits. Daily or near-daily hookah use was reported by some students, and those frequent users showed signs of nicotine dependence. There was also the co-use problem. Many college hookah smokers also smoked cigarettes, vaped, or used other tobacco products. Hookah was often an entry point. Students would try hookah first, find they enjoyed nicotine's effects, and then experiment with more portable and private forms of nicotine delivery. Longitudinal studies tracking students over their college years found that hookah use in freshman year predicted cigarette use in subsequent years, even controlling for other risk factors. Campus administrators faced challenges in responding to hookah's popularity. On one hand, hookah lounges were off-campus private businesses that universities had no direct authority over. On the other hand, hookah use was occurring on campus as well, in dormitories, in private apartments, in outdoor spaces, and universities had responsibilities for student health and safety. Some universities adopted restrictive policies, banning hookah from all campus property, including student housing, treating it the same as cigarette smoking under smoke-free campus policies. These bans were often difficult to enforce, particularly in off-campus housing where students had more autonomy. Other institutions took educational approaches, incorporating hookah into broader tobacco prevention programs, providing information about health risks, offering cessation support for students who wanted to quit. The effectiveness of these programs varied. Knowledge-based interventions simply telling students about risks rarely changed behavior. More intensive interventions that addressed social norms and built skills for resisting peer pressure showed more promise but were resource-intensive. Student health centers reported seeing patients with hookah-related health complaints, acute carbon monoxide poisoning from sessions in poorly ventilated rooms, respiratory infections potentially linked to shared mouthpieces, exacerbation of asthma. These cases were individually concerning but not numerous enough to generate widespread alarm on most campuses. The commercialization of hookah culture on and around campuses also raised equity concerns. Hookah lounges and tobacco retailers targeted students with marketing, promotions, and loyalty programs. Students with limited disposable income might spend significant amounts on hookah sessions, money that could have been used for food, books, or other necessities. There were also cultural appropriation debates. As hookah became more mainstream among American college students, questions arose about whether non-Middle Eastern students were respectfully engaging with a cultural practice or simply consuming an exotic commodity stripped of meaning. Some students from Middle Eastern and South Asian backgrounds expressed frustration that hookah, a practice their families had maintained as cultural tradition, was being turned into a party activity by people with no connection to or understanding of its origins. These debates sometimes played out in campus organizations and cultural centers. Middle Eastern student associations might host hookah nights as cultural events, educational opportunities to share history and tradition. Other students might see these events purely as social opportunities, missing or ignoring the cultural context. The role of social media in amplifying hookah culture among youth cannot be overstated. Instagram, in particular, became a platform for hookah lifestyle content. Users posted photos of elaborate hookah setups, smoke tricks, lounge interiors. Hashtags like number hookah, number shisha, and number nargile accumulated millions of posts. The visual appeal of hookah, the colorful setups, the photogenic smoke made it perfect for social media sharing. This online presence created feedback loops. Young people saw hookah content in their feeds, became curious, visited lounges, posted their own content, which in turn reached more young people. Influencers emerged who built followings around hookah content, reviewing flavors, demonstrating tricks, promoting products. Some parlayed these followings into brand partnerships and sponsorships. The commercialization of hookah through social media had public health implications. Content that glamorized smoking, that associated hookah with beauty, fun, and social success, functioned as advertising even when it wasn't explicitly sponsored. Young people exposed to this content were more likely to view hookah favorably and to try it themselves. Regulators struggled to address this dynamic. Traditional tobacco advertising restrictions focused on paid media, television, print, billboards. User-generated content on social media occupied a gray area. Platforms had policies against tobacco promotion, but enforcement was inconsistent, and the sheer volume of content made comprehensive moderation impossible. The trajectory of hookah in youth culture followed patterns seen with other substances and behaviors. Initial adoption by trendsetters and cultural explorers, diffusion through social networks, mainstreaming as practices became normalized, and eventually either entrenchment or decline, as new trends emerged and public health responses intensified. By the late 2010s, there were signs that hookah's peak among American college students had passed. Prevalence rates plateaued, and in some surveys began to decline. Competition from vaping, increasing regulatory attention, and perhaps the natural ebb and flow of youth trends all contributed. Yet hookah maintained a significant presence, particularly in areas with large Middle Eastern and South Asian populations and in cities where lounge culture remained vibrant. The lessons from hookah's penetration of youth culture are relevant beyond this particular substance. They speak to how young people encounter and adopt risky behaviors, how social contexts shape perceptions of harm, how commercial interests exploit youth markets, and how public health interventions must grapple with cultural complexity rather than relying solely on fear-based messaging. The medical establishment's relationship with hookah has always been complicated, shaped by incomplete evidence, cultural assumptions, and the perpetual tension between harm reduction and abstinence-only approaches. In the early centuries of hookah use, physicians in Mughal India and Safavid Persia incorporated water pipe smoking into their therapeutic repertoires. The humoral medical theory that dominated pre-modern medicine held that tobacco possessed certain temperamental qualities it was considered hot and dry, and that water, being cool and moist, could balance these qualities. The act of smoking through water was thus not merely recreational, but potentially therapeutic, a way to administer tobacco's stimulating effects without its harsher consequences. Court physicians prescribed hookah for various ailments, digestive complaints, melancholy, weakness of the lungs, all might be addressed with carefully prepared tobacco smoked through water. The ritual itself, they believed, had therapeutic value. The act of sitting, breathing rhythmically, focusing attention on the draw and release of smoke, created a meditative state that could calm nervous disorders and restore equilibrium. These beliefs persisted well into the 19th century, even as European medicine began to develop more empirical approaches. When European physicians encountered hookah use in their colonial territories, their responses varied. Some dismissed it as native superstition. Others, more curious, conducted observations and sometimes adopted the practice themselves, at least experimentally. Dr. James Johnson, a British physician who wrote about his experiences in India in the early 19th century, noted that hookah smoking seemed to provide relief for some respiratory conditions, though he was cautious about endorsing it without more systematic study. Other British doctors in India recommended hookah as preferable to cigar smoking for patients with delicate constitutions, reasoning that the water cooling made it gentler on the throat and lungs. The rise of modern epidemiology in the 20th century changed the conversation entirely. The landmark studies linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer in the 1950s and 1960s, the work of Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill in Britain, and similar research in the United States created a new framework for thinking about tobacco. Smoking was no longer a question of humoral balance or individual constitution. It was a population-level health catastrophe. Initially, hookah was largely absent from this research. Most epidemiological studies focused on cigarettes, which were by far the dominant form of tobacco use in Western countries, where much of the research was conducted. In Middle Eastern and South Asian countries where hookah use was common, research infrastructure was less developed, and other public health priorities, infectious diseases, malnutrition, lack of sanitation commanded attention. The first serious medical research on hookah's health effects emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, primarily from researchers in Egypt, Lebanon, and other countries where use was prevalent. These studies, published in regional medical journals and sometimes in international publications, began to document associations between hookah smoking and chronic bronchitis, reduced lung function, and other respiratory problems. A landmark study published in 1991 by Egyptian researchers examined several hundred hookah smokers and found significantly higher rates of chronic, obstructive pulmonary disease compared to non-smokers. The findings were concerning but did not receive wide attention outside the region. It was not until the 2000s, as hookah use spread in Western countries, that major international public health organizations took notice. WHO commissioned reviews of the evidence. The CDC began including hookah in its tobacco surveillance. Academic medical centers in the United States and Europe started conducting their own studies. What emerged was a picture of substantial harm, though quantifying that harm precisely proved challenging. Unlike cigarettes, which are consumed in standardized units, a single cigarette, with well-established dose-response relationships, hookah sessions vary enormously in duration, in tobacco consumption, in how deeply and frequently smokers inhale. A casual hookah user might smoke once a month for 30 minutes. A heavy user might have daily sessions lasting 2 hours. Clinical studies measured biomarkers: nicotine metabolites in urine, carbon monoxide in exhaled breath, inflammatory markers in blood. The results consistently showed that hookah sessions produced significant exposure to tobacco toxicants. Heart rate increased during smoking, blood pressure rose, arterial stiffness, a marker of cardiovascular risk, worsened acutely after sessions. Long-term cohort studies, following groups of hookah smokers over years, found increased risks of multiple conditions. Lung cancer risk appeared elevated, though the magnitude was debated because many hookah smokers also smoked cigarettes, making it difficult to isolate hookah's independent contribution. Cardiovascular disease risk was more clearly established. Hookah smokers had higher rates of heart attacks and strokes than non-smokers. Reproductive health effects emerged as another concern. Studies found associations between hookah smoking during pregnancy and low birth weight, premature birth, and other adverse outcomes. Male fertility appeared affected, with research showing reduced sperm quality among hookah smokers. The dental and oral health consequences were also documented. Hookah smokers had higher rates of periodontal disease, tooth loss, and oral cancers. The direct contact between smoke and oral tissues, combined with the long duration of exposure during sessions, created conditions for significant damage. Yet, throughout this accumulating evidence, a disconnect persisted between what research showed and what many users believed. Surveys consistently found that hookah smokers, particularly young people, perceived hookah as less harmful than cigarettes. When asked why, respondents cited the water filtration, the pleasant flavors, the social rather than solitary nature of use, and the absence of the chemical additives they associated with commercial cigarettes. This perception gap became a major focus of public health communication efforts. Campaigns sought to counter the myths. Water does not filter out the toxins. One hookah session equals 100 cigarettes. Hookah smoke contains cancer-causing chemicals. The messages were clear but often ineffective. Behavioral research suggested that factual correction alone rarely changes deeply held beliefs, especially when those beliefs are reinforced by social contexts and lived experience. Some researchers argued for more nuanced messaging. Instead of saying hookah was as bad as cigarettes, they suggested emphasizing that hookah carried serious health risks that should not be ignored. Instead of trying to scare users away, they proposed harm reduction approaches, educating users about ways to reduce exposure, shorter sessions, better ventilation, avoiding sharing mouthpieces, encouraging them to use less frequently, and providing cessation support for those who wanted to quit. These harm reduction proposals were controversial within public health circles. Critics argued that any message that didn't emphasize complete abstinence risked being interpreted as permission to continue smoking. They pointed to tobacco industry history, where safer messaging had been used to reassure smokers and prevent quitting. Supporters of harm reduction countered that absolutist messaging had limited effectiveness with hookah users. Many were not interested in quitting entirely, especially in cultures where hookah was deeply embedded in social life. Providing them with information to reduce harm, even if they continued some use, could still improve population health outcomes. The medical profession itself remained divided. Some physicians, particularly those serving Middle Eastern and South Asian communities, took pragmatic approaches, counseling patients about risks while acknowledging cultural contexts. Others adhered to strict abstinence messaging, viewing any tobacco use as unacceptable. Treatment for hookah addiction developed slowly. Most smoking cessation programs and pharmacological aids were designed around cigarette smoking patterns. Daily use, regular dosing, specific withdrawal symptoms. Hookah smokers often had different patterns, intermittent use, social triggers rather than individual cravings, psychological dependence on the ritual and setting as much as on nicotine itself. Nicotine replacement therapy patches, gum, lozenges, showed mixed results with hookah smokers. Behavioral interventions, particularly those that address social and cultural factors, seemed more promising. Group sessions that allowed hookah smokers to discuss alternatives, to strategize around social situations, to gradually reduce frequency, showed some success in clinical trials. Yet access to such specialized treatment remained limited. Most smoking cessation resources focused on cigarettes. Hookah smokers seeking help often found themselves in programs that didn't quite fit their needs, led by counselors who lacked understanding of hookah use patterns and cultural contexts. The paradox of hookah in medical practice persisted into the present day. Here was a practice with demonstrated harms, yet one that was culturally valued and socially embedded in ways that made simple prohibition or medicalized treatment inadequate responses. The challenge for medicine was not just scientific measuring risks, developing interventions, but deeply social. How to engage with practices that carry meaning beyond their pharmacological effects. Behind every hookah session is an ecosystem of craftspeople, merchants, and entrepreneurs whose labor transforms raw materials into finished products and whose networks move goods across borders and into consumers' hands. The traditional hookah makers, concentrated in places like Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, and parts of India, practiced a craft passed down through generations. These artisans specialized in particular components. In Damascus and Aleppo, before the Syrian civil war devastated these ancient production centers, master craftsmen worked copper and brass into intricate body tubes, hammering patterns by hand, joining pieces with precision that ensured airtight seals. Glassblowers in Hebron, in the West Bank, produced the ornate bases that distinguished quality hookahs. The craft required skill and dangerous proximity to furnaces where molten glass glowed white-hot. Artisans would gather molten glass on the end of long pipes, blowing and shaping it into bulbous forms, sometimes adding colored glass in layers to create patterns, sometimes leaving the glass clear so smokers could watch the water bubble and smoke swirl. The bowl makers worked primarily in clay, shaping and firing pieces that needed to withstand repeated heating and cooling without cracking. Egyptian bowl makers developed distinctive funnel shapes and vortex designs that distributed heat more evenly. Syrian bowl makers favored different geometries. Each regional style had adherents who swore by its superiority for smoke quality and session length. Hose production was perhaps the least artisanal component, though it too required knowledge. Traditional leather hoses were stitched and treated, often reinforced with wire coils to prevent collapse during use. Later, synthetic materials, plastic, silicone made production easier, but sometimes at the cost of the aesthetic qualities that made traditional hoses desirable. The assembly of these components into finished hookahs happened in workshops that functioned as both manufacturing sites and retail spaces. A customer might commission a custom hookah, selecting a base from one craftsman, a body tube from another, specifying finishes and details. The workshop owner would assemble the pieces, test the seals, and deliver a functional, often beautiful, object. This artisanal economy operated alongside, and sometimes in tension with, mass production. By the late 20th century, factories in China and other countries began producing cheap hookahs for export. These mass-produced versions sacrificed craft for cost. They were made from inferior materials, assembled without the attention to detail that traditional craftsmen brought, and often failed after minimal use. But they were affordable, and for many consumers, particularly in new markets, price mattered more than quality. The tensions between artisanal and mass production reflected broader debates about authenticity and cultural appropriation. Was a hookah made in a Chinese factory by workers who had never smoked one, designed for export to American college students, still a legitimate part of hookah culture? Or was it a bastardization, a cheap imitation that reduced a cultural practice to a consumable commodity? Tobacco preparation was its own specialized craft. In Egypt and Lebanon, tobacco processors developed proprietary blends and techniques. They sourced tobacco leaves from specific regions, Syrian tobacco for its smoothness, Virginia tobacco for its strength, and mixed them with molasses, glycerin, and flavorings in proportions that were closely guarded secrets. The processing facilities, ranging from small family operations to larger commercial enterprises, were sites of both craft and commerce. Workers washed and cut tobacco, cooked molasses to the right consistency, blended ingredients in large drums. The air in these facilities was thick with the scent of tobacco and fruit essences. The labor was often carried out by hand, though some larger operations employed machinery. Quality control in traditional operations was a matter of taste and experience. Master blenders would smoke samples of each batch, adjusting ratios and ingredients based on their judgment. This artisanal approach produced inconsistent results. One batch might be perfect, another too dry or too sweet, but it also allowed for creativity and regional variation that standardized industrial production eliminated. The marketing and branding of hookah tobacco emerged as a distinct industry in the late 20th century. Brands like Al-Fakir, Nakla, and Starbuzz became internationally recognized. They competed not just on flavor but on image, positioning themselves through packaging design, sponsored events, and later social media presence. Al-Fakir, a United Arab Emirates brand, marketed itself as premium and traditional. Its packaging used Arabic calligraphy and references to heritage. Starbuzz, an American brand, took the opposite approach. Flashy graphics, celebrity endorsements, flavors with names like Blue Mist and Sex on the Beach that signaled modernity and hedonism over tradition. This branding created cultural capital. Smoking a particular brand signaled affiliation with certain values or aesthetics. It was not just about nicotine delivery. It was about identity. Young people in Beirut might smoke different brands than their counterparts in Brooklyn, and these choices said something about how they positioned themselves culturally. The retail ecology was equally complex. In cities with established hookah cultures, specialized shops sold tobacco, charcoal, and equipment. These shops were often gathering places where enthusiasts discussed new products, debated the merits of different brands, and sought advice from knowledgeable shopkeepers who functioned as informal educators. In newer markets, particularly in the West, retail happened through multiple channels. Some specialty shops emerged, often run by immigrants who brought expertise from their home countries. But hookah supplies also appeared in less expected places: tobacco shops that added a hookah section, convenience stores in neighborhoods with Middle Eastern populations, and increasingly, online retailers that promised discretion and convenience. Online sales transformed the market. Websites offered vast selections, competitive prices, and anonymity. For younger buyers concerned about age verification in physical stores, online purchasing offered a workaround, though responsible retailers implemented age checks. The e-commerce model also allowed niche brands to reach customers who would never encounter them in physical stores. The economics of the hookah industry, while difficult to quantify precisely, involved significant flows of capital. Annual global sales of hookah, tobacco, and equipment were estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars by the 2010s. This was a fraction of the cigarette industry's scale, but it was substantial enough to support thousands of businesses and employ tens of thousands of people. Trade regulations complicated international commerce. Tobacco products face import duties, health restrictions, and varying legal frameworks across countries. Exporters navigated complex regulatory landscapes, sometimes legally, sometimes through grey markets, where products entered countries without proper documentation or tax payment. The Syrian civil war, beginning in 2011, dealt a devastating blow to traditional hookah craft. Aleppo and Damascus, ancient centers of hookah production, were partially destroyed. Craftsmen fled, workshops closed, supply chains broke. Some artisans relocated to Turkey, Lebanon, or Europe, attempting to rebuild their trades in exile, but much traditional knowledge and many historic workshops were lost. This destruction accelerated the shift toward mass production and toward countries with intact manufacturing infrastructure. Turkey increased its hookah production. Egypt expanded its tobacco processing capacity. China's role in producing low-cost hookahs grew. The geography of hookah craft and commerce was being redrawn by conflict and market forces. Within this changing landscape, debates about quality, authenticity, and cultural preservation intensified. Purists mourned the loss of traditional crafts and the rise of mass-produced substitutes. Pragmatists noted that wider access and lower prices brought hookah to people who could never have afforded artisanal pieces. The two positions were not easily reconciled. The hookah's history is not a simple tale of a device and its users. It is a story about how technology, culture, commerce, and chemistry intertwine. It is about how something can be simultaneously tradition and trend, communal ritual and individual addiction, cultural heritage and public health threat. The narratives we construct around hookah matter. For some, it is a link to ancestral practices, a way to maintain cultural identity in diaspora. For others, it is a fashionable social activity, a way to signal cosmopolitanism. For public health officials, it is a vector for nicotine dependence and preventable disease. Each of these stories is partial, and each contains elements of truth. What the history teaches is humility about our capacity to control substances and behaviors through law alone. Prohibition, stigma, and punishment have limited effectiveness when social practices are deeply rooted or when they offer genuine pleasures and social connection. At the same time, laissez-faire approaches that ignore health harms are ethically untenable. The water in the hookah's base, bubbling softly, has always been a symbol. To early users, it symbolized purification, the transformation of harsh smoke into something refined. To modern users, it might symbolize tradition, community, or simply a pleasant evening. To researchers, It symbolizes the gap between perception and reality, the way belief can obscure chemistry. Smoke, by its nature, dissipates. It rises, spreads, and vanishes. But the effects of inhaling it, nicotine coursing through blood, tar deposited in lungs, carbon monoxide binding to hemoglobin, these persist. The hookah's story is one of that tension between ephemeral experience and lasting consequence. As the charcoal dims and the session ends, as the last traces of apple-scented smoke fade into the air, we are left with questions. How do we balance cultural respect with public health? How do we regulate without erasing tradition? How do we educate without moralizing? How do we acknowledge pleasure without ignoring harm? There are no easy answers. The hookah, patient as always, sits on its table, empty now, waiting for the next session, the next group of friends, the next round of stories. The glass base still holds water. The hose coils beside it. The bowl is cool, and somewhere, someone is already preparing for another evening, another gathering, another attempt to find connection and comfort in the ritual of smoke and water. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The hookah's journey from Persian palace to American college town is a variation on themes as old as trade itself. The movement of goods and customs across borders, the adaptation of practices to new contexts, the tension between tradition and modernity, the human desire for pleasure and the social costs it sometimes incurs. The future will write its own chapter. Perhaps stricter regulations will reduce hookah use to a marginal practice. Perhaps new technologies will transform it into something unrecognizable. Perhaps it will persist, adapted and resilient, as it has for centuries. What seems certain is that as long as people gather to talk, to laugh, to mark time together, some will reach for devices that produce smoke, and some will find ways to tell themselves that this smoke, this particular configuration of technology and chemistry, is different from all the others. The story ends where it began, with a plant, a fire, a chamber of water, and the human capacity for both ingenuity and self-deception. The hookah remains what it has always been, a mirror reflecting our desires for connection, for tradition, for pleasure, and our willingness to negotiate with risk. The smoke clears, the water stills, and the history, patient and precise, waits to record what comes next.